Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We will now begin with Story 1, The Lord of Misrule, when chaos was king at Christmas. For most of the year, power sat in the hands of kings, bishops, magistrates, and patriarchs. But once the winter solstice passed and Christmastide began, a peculiar inversion of order descended on many European communities, one that bewildered authorities and thrilled the peasantry. This was the season of the Lord of Misrule, a fool king crowned not with gold but with holly, folly, and temporary authority. To the untrained eye, the Lord of Misrule might seem like a jest, perhaps a clownish sideshow of medieval or Tudor Christmas festivities. But beneath the surface of revelry lay something older, almost ritualistic. His rule was short-lived, often starting on St. Stephen's Day, December 26, and lasting until Twelfth Night, January 5 or 6. Yet in that narrow window of time, the entire social order might tilt. A crown for the fool. The Lord of Misrule, known variously across regions as the Abbot of Unreason, Prince des Sots, or Rex Fatuorum, was typically a commoner or low-ranking cleric, chosen for his wit, boldness, or ability to entertain. In some instances, a young boy from the parish might be elevated to the mock throne, much like the boy bishop tradition we'll revisit later. He wore bright, often garish clothes. He presided over games, dances, inverted religious rituals, and in some cases, mock trials or absurd parliaments. The heart of the tradition lay in inversion. Fools became leaders, servants mocked masters, and processions parodied sacred rites. This temporary chaos, seemingly frivolous, echoed a much older pagan rhythm, the Saturnalia of ancient Rome. There, slaves dined like citizens and gambling was permitted. In medieval Europe, similar patterns survived, though filtered through a Christian lens. Origins in pagan solstice rituals. The clearest historical analog is Saturnalia, the Roman festival held from December 1723, where social roles were reversed, and a king of Saturnalia was elected. He held mock court, issued humorous decrees, and symbolized the brief overthrow of reason and hierarchy in favor of indulgence and laughter. With the Christianization of Europe, many such rituals were absorbed, transformed, or allowed to persist at the edges of acceptability. By the 12th century, the Lord of Misrule had taken root in ecclesiastical settings, yes, even within churches and monasteries. This was not mere tolerance. In some locales, the practice was officially sanctioned. In England, the office of the Lord of Misrule was institutionalized at royal courts and large manor houses. During the Tudor period, records from the court of Henry VIII note expenses for costumes, pageants, and theatrical performances tied directly to the office. An appointed disruptor. The Lord of Misrule did not operate alone. In wealthier households or parishes, he commanded a troop of revelers, his court, which could include jesters, actors, dancers, and musicians. Their job was to disturb the peace in just the right measure. He might enter a dining hall unannounced and declare a mock proclamation that the cook must sing a ballad or the vicar must perform a dance. These moments, comic as they seem, held deeper meaning. In societies bound tightly by status, obedience, and religious fear, such inversion became a pressure valve, a momentary space where laughter mocked power, and the powerless could speak freely. Notably, this wasn't always welcomed. While some lords or bishops embraced the tradition, others found it deeply unsettling. Chronicles from the 14th and 15th centuries show complaints from officials about unruly conduct, blasphemous plays, and the general erosion of good Christian order. Yet communities clung to the tradition. The risks of mock authority. The misrule was not without its dangers. In some years and regions, the mock rulers took things too far. Riots, drunken brawls, or property damage occurred not as rare outbursts, but as expected side effects. There are documented instances where towns imposed fines on the Lord of Misrule or banned his presence altogether due to excessive reveling. One 16th century English town record notes, "The Lord of Mismanners, so called, was this year whipped at the stocks for having offended the mayor with a torch set too close to his coat." It was a fine line. The Lord of Misrule needed to be disruptive but not too disruptive, entertaining but not blasphemous. When balance was lost, the community reminded him that his authority was only ever a parody. Royal courts and licensed folly. At court, especially under the Tudors and early Stuarts, the tradition evolved into something grander. Edward VI, at only 11 years old, hosted such revels with elaborate court masques and interludes, often coordinated by high-ranking court jesters or poets. The office of the revels, a real administrative body, was tasked with organizing festivities that blurred the line between state ceremony and carnival absurdity. Ironically, the more structured the misrule became, the more obvious its contradictions. What did it mean to authorize chaos, to carefully plan spontaneity? Still, the elite found the practice politically useful. It demonstrated magnanimity and humanity. Even the king laughs, they could say. But laughter, once unleashed, is hard to contain. As the early modern period wore on, and tensions between Protestants and Catholics deepened across Europe, these festivities came under greater scrutiny. What then made the Lord of Misrule so threatening to the emerging modern order? Unfinished reflections. Was the Lord of Misrule merely a quaint tradition, an echo of pagan pasts and merrymaking? Or did he represent something more dangerous, a symbolic revolt, brief but potent, against the very structures of feudal and ecclesiastical power? In the next section, we'll explore how this tradition collided with the rise of Reformation values, the Puritan backlash, and a slow but steady decline in festive misrule. When the revelry of the Lord of Misrule reached its zenith during the Tudor and early Stuart periods, the festive chaos it embodied seemed unassailable. But just as the Lord's laughter echoed through manor halls and village greens, a chill wind of disapproval began to blow across Europe, signaling a seismic cultural and religious shift. At the heart of this transformation was the Reformation, and more specifically, the rise of Puritan ideology, an austere worldview in which the Lord of Misrule had no rightful place. A changing mood. By the early 17th century, Protestant reformers had been chipping away at long-established religious customs across England and parts of Europe. While some elements of festive life were tolerated, there was growing discomfort with practices deemed unbiblical, superstitious, or morally corrosive. The Lord of Misrule, symbol of inversion, license, and excess, was an easy target. Puritan thinkers viewed the entire Christmas season with suspicion. William Prynne, a prominent Puritan pamphleteer, condemned holiday revelry as heathenish vanity. In his extensive 1633 work, Histriomastics, he criticized not just theater and feasting, but also the Lord of Misrule directly, describing him as an imp of misrule and a profane idol. Prynne's puritanical colleagues were not alone in their disdain. The association of the Lord of Misrule with drunkenness, lewd behavior, and ritual mockery made it incompatible with the rigid, orderly society the reformers envisioned. Their concerns were not purely theological. They also saw this figure as a threat to social stability. After all, what was misrule but a temporary rehearsal of rebellion? Christmas comes under fire. The assault on the Lord of Misrule cannot be separated from the broader attack on Christmas itself. In 1647, under the Commonwealth government that followed the English Civil War, Parliament officially banned Christmas celebrations. Churches were ordered to stay closed on December 25th. Shops were to remain open. No decorations, no feasts, and certainly no foolish lords parading in mock ceremony. The official reason: Christmas had no basis in Scripture and was tainted by pagan and Catholic traditions. But behind the theological veneer was a political goal: to reshape English society around sobriety, piety, and discipline. In this new order, the Lord of Misrule was not just unwelcome, he was dangerous. In place of misrule, Puritans offered sermons and fasting. The brief, joyous inversion of the social order was replaced with a year-round emphasis on obedience and introspection. Even laughter was viewed with suspicion. The Lord was not merely exiled, he was exorcised. Resistance in the streets. Yet traditions rarely vanish quietly. Across England and Scotland, people resisted the ban with quiet defiance or open protest. In Norwich, apprentices rioted when officials tried to enforce a ban on Christmas festivities. In Canterbury, a mock king of Christmas led protests in 1647, and the city saw a week of revelry in direct rebellion against Puritan restrictions. These were not just calls for fun, they were symbolic acts of cultural preservation. Communities refused to let go of traditions that, however chaotic, reminded them of something deeply human: the need for joy in the depths of winter. Even in the absence of the official lord, misrule found its way back into homes and taverns. If no one could declare a jester king in the town square, people would whisper their jokes in candlelit parlors and drink to the memory of better days. The Lord of Misrule had gone underground. The Restoration and the ghost of misrule. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, so too were many Christmas traditions. Charles II, a lover of theater and festive spectacle, welcomed back the holiday and its trappings. Plays returned, feasting resumed, holly and ivy adorned homes once more. But something had changed. The Lord of Misrule did not regain his former glory. He became more of a nostalgic symbol than a living tradition. In many towns, he was quietly dropped from the calendar. Where he lingered, his role was tamed, less a disruptor and more a stage prop. The Restoration marked the beginning of a shift from communal to private celebration. Christmas became a family affair, not a civic spectacle. Revels gave way to rituals. The Lord of Misrule, whose very power depended on collective participation and sanctioned inversion, could not thrive in this new context. By the 18th century, the tradition had largely vanished from England. In Scotland, where the Kirk had always been especially hostile to Christmas, he had never really taken hold at all. In France, where the Prince des Sots once led elaborate Epiphany festivities, the Enlightenment slowly strangled the appetite for mockery dressed in ecclesiastical robes. The Lord of Misrule was, for all intents and purposes, forgotten. A reflection of social tensions. The rise and fall of the Lord of Misrule is not just the story of a seasonal character. It reflects deeper social tensions that still echo today. His reign was brief by design, but powerful in meaning. In that inversion where the servant became king and the king bowed to laughter, communities found a means to cope with rigid hierarchies. They laughed at their rulers not because they hated them, but because they needed space to breathe. This temporary folly also served as a reminder to the powerful: your rule, while enduring, is not divine. Even the grandest monarch could be made to wear a jester's hat for a night. But the shift toward a more individualistic, consumer-driven holiday left little space for communal pageantry rooted in ritual subversion. When Christmas became a time for personal reflection and domestic tradition, the Lord of Misrule, with his torchlight processions and raucous banter, simply no longer fit. And so he slipped into memory. Survivals and echoes. Yet not all was lost. Fragments of the tradition survive in modern customs. The idea of holiday office parties, where hierarchies are temporarily relaxed. The Christmas cracker jokes, which gently mock the serious. The crown of gold paper that mirrors the fool's garland. Even the New Year's Eve countdown, with its spirit of anticipation and communal release, feels like a diluted echo of misrule. Some folk traditions in rural Europe still preserve the spirit, if not the name, of the Lord of Misrule. In the Basque Country and parts of Eastern Europe, winter festivals feature masked characters who bring disorder, merriment, and symbolic chaos to the village before the year resets. But these are fading. In the modern world, with its year-round noise and shrinking attention spans, the structured chaos of the Lord of Misrule no longer captures the public imagination. He belongs to an older rhythm of time, one in which winter was long, food was scarce, and the inversion of order was not a joke but a ritual necessity. A lasting question: why did communities once require misrule to survive winter's grip? Was it about laughter or something deeper? A way to remember that even in the coldest, darkest months, joy could rise from the margins, if only for a moment. And what does it say about us that we no longer need such figures? We'll explore the psychological and societal functions the Lord of Misrule once served, and how his absence has subtly reshaped the way we understand power, celebration, and the meaning of Christmas. The Lord of Misrule, clad in ribbons and absurdity, was more than a mere jester presiding over medieval feasts. He was a deeply symbolic figure, his brief reign a mirror held up to power, ritual, and the human psyche. Though he has long vanished from our holiday calendars, the imprint he left on culture and consciousness lingers in unexpected places. This final section explores why societies created the Lord of Misrule in the first place, what role this figure served in the broader emotional fabric of pre-modern life, and what we lost perhaps unknowingly when the Fool King was dethroned for good. Ritual inversion, a safety valve for society. Anthropologists have long noted the recurrence of ritual inversion across cultures and epochs, whether in Roman Saturnalia, medieval carnival, or even certain indigenous rituals. The pattern is familiar. The normal social order is turned upside down in a controlled, time-limited fashion. Authority figures are mocked. The poor are temporarily elevated. Taboo behaviors are allowed or at least tolerated. This isn't chaos for its own sake. Instead, as theorists like Victor Turner and Mikkel Bakhtin have argued, these inversions serve a stabilizing function. They reaffirm social norms by temporarily suspending them. In mocking the rules, people acknowledge their existence and perhaps feel more inclined to follow them afterward. The Lord of Misrule, then, was not a threat to order. He was its dark twin, necessary to reaffirm the hierarchy through licensed disorder. His foolish proclamations, wild parades, and mock ceremonies allowed communities to laugh, breathe, and renew themselves. By making fun of bishops, kings, or landlords without real risk of punishment, the people acknowledged power while safely venting their frustrations. It was a form of sanctioned irreverence, a performance of rebellion that ended, predictably, in submission. A crowned fool is never truly dangerous, so long as everyone remembers that his reign ends at Twelfth Night. The emotional logic of winter festivity. It is easy in the modern world to forget just how emotionally heavy winter once was. Before electricity, before global trade, before central heating, winter in Europe was a season of scarcity, cold, and isolation. The weeks after the harvest were not holidays, they were periods of anxious waiting. Food was rationed, disease was common, days were short and nights long. For many, Christmas wasn't a celebration, it was a defiant ritual meant to break the silence of snow-covered time. In that context, Misrule made sense. By allowing people to laugh in the face of cold and hierarchy, the Lord of Misrule offered emotional relief. His reign often included food sharing, games, song, and satire acts that countered hunger, boredom, and social rigidity. Moreover, the absurdity of his character, making priests sing bawdy songs or forcing magistrates to serve peasants at dinner, offered a strange form of solidarity. It reminded everyone that the world could, at least for a moment, be seen differently, that the poor could laugh, that the mighty could fall down if only in jest. Death, renewal, and the fool archetype. Beyond sociology and anthropology, there is a deeper, perhaps archetypal, meaning in the figure of the Lord of Misrule. In many cultures, the fool is a carrier of hidden wisdom. He wears the mask of idiocy but speaks uncomfortable truths. He breaks decorum not just to amuse, but to challenge. Shakespeare's fools like the one in King Lear are often wiser than their masters. The Lord of Misrule occupied a similar role. He was allowed to say things that others could not. He could critique the feast's extravagance, mock the bishop's hypocrisy, or joke about the king's taxes, all under the cover of play. In doing so, he revealed cracks in the system, though he was never allowed to exploit them. Some scholars have drawn parallels between the Lord of Misrule and death and rebirth myths. His brief reign occurs at the turn of the year, when the old is dying and the new has yet to be born. In that liminal space between decay and renewal, he emerges, crowned, foolish, festive, and destined to fall. In this view, the Lord of Misrule isn't just a character, he's a seasonal archetype. A reminder that the world must unravel a little before it can be stitched together again. Why did he disappear? If the Lord of Misrule served such deep emotional and social functions, why did he disappear? There are several reasons. The rise of Protestant and Enlightenment rationalism. Both movements, though distinct, placed increasing emphasis on order, discipline, and moral clarity. A holiday figure who embodied contradiction, inversion, and chaotic joy didn't fit this mold. The privatization of holiday rituals. As families moved away from communal celebrations and into private, domestic spaces, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, the shared performance of Misrule lost its venue. It's hard to crown a neighborhood fool in a drawing room. The professionalization of entertainment. With the rise of theaters, novels, and later, television, satire and comedy became commodities. You no longer needed a Lord of Misrule, you could just buy a ticket to the pantomime. The sanitization of Christmas. In the 19th century, especially in England and the United States, Christmas was rebranded. Thanks to figures like Charles Dickens, it became a holiday of charity, domestic warmth, and quiet spiritual reflection. There was no place for torchlit parades and drunken parody in this new vision of Christmas. And so the Lord faded. Not with a bang, but with a long, silent sigh. No decree marked his end. He simply stopped being invited. Modern echoes in unexpected places. Yet like all folkloric figures, the Lord of Misrule never entirely died. His spirit lingers in odd corners of modern life. Carnival traditions in Latin America and Europe still contain elements of misrule, parades of inversion, masked leaders, and mock rulers. April Fool's Day, though now secular and lighthearted, echoes the logic of sanctioned disorder. Workplace holiday parties sometimes create informal, temporary reversals. Interns playing pranks, managers donning silly sweaters, laughter replacing hierarchy for a night. Comedy roasts, where powerful figures are publicly mocked with their consent, replicate the spirit if not the ritual of the Lord's brief reign. Even political satire, when it punches upward, may be a kind of misrule by other means, a way to laugh at those in power without threatening the structure itself. What we lost and perhaps still need. In forgetting the Lord of Misrule, we may have lost more than a colorful tradition. We may have lost a ritualized outlet for collective emotion, one that allowed communities to let off steam, process hardship, and explore uncomfortable truths safely. Modern life is filled with pressures, hierarchies, and stresses, but unlike our ancestors, we have fewer formal ways to invert or release them. Without symbolic reversals, frustration finds other outlets: online outrage, conspiracy theories, or even literal unrest. Perhaps what the Lord of Misrule offered was not just laughter, but ritual catharsis. He reminded people that even in the darkest month, joy was possible. That power was not absolute. That communities could reimagine themselves, if only for 12 nights. In a world growing ever more rigid and anxious, could a little misrule be exactly what we need? A final reflection. The Lord of Misrule was never meant to last. That was his power. He emerged in a blaze of absurdity, reminded us of the world's fragility and flexibility, and then vanished like the snow itself. But the need he fulfilled still lingers. And so, as you sip your cocoa or hang your lights, spare a moment for the fool in the garland crown, standing quietly at the edge of history. He does not ask to rule again, only to be remembered. Story 2. Yule logs and ashes, the lifespan of a smoldering tradition. The fire crackles, sparks leap upward, and shadows flicker across stone walls. The scene is familiar, comforting even a winter hearth lit during the long nights of December. Yet beneath this simple image lies a forgotten tradition, rich with symbolism, ritual, and survival: the burning of the Yule log. Today, when we hear Yule log, many imagine a chocolate cake shaped like a log, served during holiday dinners. Others may think of the televised fireplace loop's digital embers on endless repeat. But centuries ago, the Yule log was not just a decoration or a dessert. It was a ceremonial act, a communal gathering, and in many households, a lifeline through the coldest nights of the year. Before it became an aesthetic flourish, the Yule log was a deeply rooted winter custom, one that connected ancient agricultural rhythms, pagan beliefs, Christian reinterpretations, and the harsh realities of pre-industrial life. Let us go back not to the Victorian parlor, but further, to the darkened fields and forest edges of early Europe. Yule, a word with deep roots. The word Yule predates Christmas. Its origins lie in the Old Norse term Jal or Jalablad, a winter festival celebrated in honor of the gods, especially Odin, and marking the time around the winter solstice. This festival was not a single day, but a a liminal period when the year turned. The sun began its slow return, and the veil between worlds thinned. It was a time of feasting, sacrifice, and storytelling. The Yule log, in its earliest form, likely began as part of these solstice rituals. For Germanic and Scandinavian peoples, fire was sacred. It symbolized both destruction and rebirth. To light a great log and burn it through the longest night was not just practical, it was symbolic. The fire coaxed the sun to return. The smoke carried prayers. The embers were the soul of the household. The selection and the ceremony. In traditional households across England, France, Scandinavia, and parts of Eastern Europe, the Yule log wasn't just any piece of firewood. It was carefully selected, the largest, hardest, most durable piece of timber available. It might be an entire tree trunk. In rural areas, whole families would venture out together to choose it: oak in England, cherry in France, birch in the Nordic countries, depending on regional availability and folklore. Once chosen, it was often decorated not with tinsel or baubles, but with greenery, carved symbols, or even soaked in wine or salt. In some regions, it was sprinkled with grain to ensure a good harvest. In others, small offerings were placed on or around the log: bread, herbs, or a pinch of last year's ashes. The lighting itself was ceremonial. The log was typically lit with a piece of the previous year's Yule log, saved precisely for this purpose. This ritual link between years reinforced continuity, protection, and prosperity. The log would be burned slowly, sometimes over multiple days. In well-constructed hearths, embers might smolder for over a week. People gathered around the fire to share stories, drink, and reflect. Children listened to folktales. Adults passed down family histories. Sometimes, predictions were made from the sparks, the way the smoke curled, or how the log burned, signs of the coming year. And when the log was finally spent, the ashes were not discarded casually. Ashes and omens. The remains of the Yule log were considered magically protective. In French and Italian tradition, ashes were spread in fields to bless the soil. In England and parts of Germany, They were stored in a small pouch or box near the hearth, said to guard against lightning, house fires, or evil spirits. Some believed the ashes could heal ailments, especially in children or livestock. Others used them in rituals to protect against witchcraft or to ensure fertility in the spring. For families in isolated rural areas living in wooden homes, surrounded by wild landscapes, the fire was not just symbolic warmth. It was literal survival. And so the Yule log, in both its burning and its remains, became a kind of spiritual insurance. Its yearly presence in the hearth was both a sacrifice and a safeguard. From pagan roots to Christian frames. As Christianity spread through Europe, many Yule traditions were absorbed into the broader celebration of Christmas. But while the Church encouraged certain aspects like the themes of light overcoming darkness, it frowned on others. The log's pagan associations, its link to pre-Christian solstice rites, and the superstitions tied to its ashes were viewed with suspicion. Yet the tradition proved stubbornly resilient. Rather than eliminate it, Christian authorities often reinterpreted the Yule log symbolism. In France, it was called the bûche de Nile, and came to represent the warmth of the Holy Family stable. In England, it was associated with hospitality, keeping the poor warm and fed during Christmastide. In some accounts, the burning of the log came to symbolize the burning away of sin, or the sacrifice of Christ. These overlays allowed the tradition to persist well into the early modern period, though in increasingly domesticated forms. Still, regional folklore persisted. In some parts of Brittany and Wales, people believed the log should be watched through the night to ward off death. In others, if the log didn't burn evenly, it was seen as a bad omen for the year ahead. Even as theological interpretations changed, the emotional and ritual core of the Yule log remained largely intact. The Yule log in domestic life. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Yule log had become a centerpiece of Christmas Eve, particularly in English, French, and Scandinavian households. Its presence marked the official beginning of the 12 days of Christmas, a sacred span from December 25 to January 6. For many, this was the most festive period of the year, with feasting, storytelling, and visiting. Lighting the Yule log became a moment of communal stillness. In an age without central heating or artificial light, a roaring fire signified not only comfort, but the passage of time. The longer the log burned, the longer the family stayed together. In some homes, it became customary to write wishes or confessions on scraps of paper and place them beneath the log as it burned. The flames were thought to purify or carry the messages to heaven. These were not loud rituals. They were quiet, steady, and deeply human. But as industrialization crept across Europe, so too did the gradual disappearance of this ancient fire. The quiet fade of the tradition. The decline of the Yule log tradition came not through banishment or controversy, but through modern convenience. As cast iron stoves replaced open hearths, the long, heavy logs no longer fit. Smaller pieces of wood became standard. The ceremonial burning of a single, massive trunk became impractical if not impossible. Urbanization also played a role. In cities, fireplaces were smaller and access to large timber more limited. Apartments lacked communal hearths and the rhythm of life changed. Factory work replaced the slow pace of agrarian cycles. The symbolic weight of the solstice waned. By the mid-19th century, even in rural areas, the burning of the Yule log had become more nostalgic than sacred. Writers began to romanticize it. Washington Irving, in his sketchbook, 1819, wrote of English Christmases and the warm glow of the Yule fire, already painting it as a tradition of the past. Charles Dickens' Christmas stories similarly drew on the fatting customs of the countryside. And so the Yule log, once a literal lifeline through the dead of winter, became a symbol and then, eventually, a cake. Unfinished reflections. How did the burning of a log become a dessert? Why did this deeply elemental tradition, tied to land, survival, and sacred time, fade so gently? We will follow the Yule log's transformation, from flaming trunk to frosted sponge roll, and from pagan fire ritual to televised nostalgia. Along the way, we'll ask what happens when we domesticate a ritual, and whether some remnants of the old flame still flicker today. The great log once burned at the heart of the winter solstice has, in modern times, become almost unrecognizable. Where once stood a sacred smoking pillar of warmth, now lies a soft, rolled sponge cake, dusted with powdered sugar and garnished with candied holly. The Yule log, in both its literal and symbolic form, has been softened, sweetened, and reshaped for the modern table. But how did this transformation happen? How did an ancient fire ritual, one of survival and community, become a dessert? And what does this say about the evolution of tradition in a world that increasingly values convenience, aesthetics, and personal indulgence over communal ritual? The decline of the hearth and the rise of the stove. To understand the Yule log's domestication, we must first consider the changing architecture of the home. For centuries, the hearth was not merely a heating source, it was the center of family life. Meals were cooked over it, stories were told beside it, and rituals like the Yule log took place within its glowing reach. But by the early 19th century, industrial innovation began to alter domestic spaces. The cast iron stove and later gas and electric heating replaced open fireplaces. These modern appliances were safer, more efficient, and required less labor, but they also removed the hearth as a central, visible gathering space. Without a wide hearth capable of holding a large log, the physical act of burning a Yule log became impractical. The spatial center of Christmas shifted from the fireplace to the Christmas tree, from communal storytelling to gift exchange. What remained of the Yule log tradition could no longer be experienced as it had been, and so it began to morph into something symbolic and eventually edible. France and the invention of the edible Yule log. The most direct reinterpretation of the tradition came from 19th century France, where the original Yule fire had been known as the bûche de Nile. As open hearths declined in the French countryside, especially in Paris and urban areas, pâtissiers began to reimagine the tradition in dessert form. The earliest versions of the cake appeared sometime in the mid to late 1800s, with culinary historians generally crediting its invention to Parisian pastry chefs between 1870 and 1890. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. A rolled sponge cake ganache, filled with buttercream or ganache, shaped and decorated to resemble a log, complete with bark-like ridges, knots, and sometimes even meringue mushrooms, sugared holly, or marzipan leaves. The bûche de Nile maintained the shape and symbolism of the original log, but stripped it of fire, ash, and ritual. In its place, it offered sweetness, visual charm, and the aesthetic of nostalgia. It was, in many ways, the perfect bourgeois holiday centerpiece, tasteful, traditional, and completely safe. The spread of the cake tradition. The edible Yule log quickly gained popularity in French-speaking regions and Catholic parts of Europe. By the early 20th century, it had become a fixture in French holiday celebrations, particularly on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. From France, the bûche spread to Belgium, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and parts of Canada, particularly Quebec. Its popularity in North America began to rise after World War II, especially among French immigrants and culinary enthusiasts. Over time, variants emerged. In Italy, similar log-shaped cakes were occasionally made for La Vigilia. In Vietnam, which was under French colonial rule during the cake's popularization, the bûche became a Christmas staple, even in the absence of a Christian majority. In Japan, French-inspired bakeries embraced the cake, and it remains popular there today as part of modern, secular Christmas celebrations. The dessert has become globalized, transcending its folkloric origins. But with each new layer of chocolate and frosting, the cake has drifted farther from the burning ritual that once defined the solstice season. Symbolism repackaged. It would be unfair to claim that the modern Yule log cake is empty of meaning. In its presentation and deliberate echo of the past, it still carries the memory of the fire. Families gather to slice it together. Children marvel at its decoration. It represents warmth, celebration, and continuity, if only in a metaphorical sense. In some ways, it reflects a broader modern impulse to consume tradition in a digestible, beautiful, and emotionally satisfying way. The fire, unpredictable and smoky, becomes a cake orderly, sweet, and safe. This is not unique to the Yule log. Across Western cultures, once sacred rituals have been transformed into symbolic objects or commodified practices. The Nativity becomes a lawn ornament. The Advent season becomes a calendar of chocolates. The hearth becomes a digital fireplace loop on a screen. Each retains a trace of the original, but only a trace. The shift from fire to frosting is a reflection of modernity itself, where danger is avoided, discomfort minimized, and meaning curated for convenience. The televised fire, simulacra of the Yule log. Perhaps the most striking example of this transformation is the televised Yule log. First broadcast in 1966 by WPIX-TV in New York City, the original Yule log program featured a looped 16mm film of a fireplace burning, accompanied by Christmas music. Created as a gesture for apartment dwellers without fireplaces, it was meant to evoke a sense of warmth and nostalgia during the holidays. The program was enormously popular and was aired annually until 1989, later revived in the 2000s and mimicked by countless streaming services and YouTube channels. In essence, the modern Yule log returned to the screen as a simulation of fire, a full-circle echo of the original burning log, now divorced from smell, heat, or ritual. Viewers didn't gather around the log to receive blessings or read omens in the smoke. Instead, they used it to set a mood, a cozy, manufactured ambience that required no participation beyond passive observation. It is, in some ways, the logical end point of the log's evolution from communal fire to dessert to digital backdrop. What the fire meant. In the original tradition, the burning of the Yule log was not aesthetic, it was functional, symbolic, and ritualistic. It provided heat in a cold season. It brought people together. It created a sense of continuity through the symbolic use of last year's ashes. It served spiritual, agricultural, and emotional purposes. There was no performance, no perfect presentation. The log cracked, hissed, and smoked. Its scent filled the home. Its ashes were messy, meaningful. Modern equivalents are cleaner, sweeter, and easier, but also perhaps emptier. This is not to romanticize hardship or to claim superiority for the past. The modern booch is delightful in its own way, but it is important to understand what we trade when we repackage rituals for modern sensibilities. The edible log and the televised hearth are echoes of fire, but not fire itself. Unfinished reflections. Why do we preserve the form of the Yule log so carefully? Its shape, its seasonal timing, but let its original function slip away? Is this preservation of appearance a kind of comfort? Or are we clinging to symbols we no longer fully understand? We will look more closely at the final remnants of the Yule log tradition still practiced in rural corners of Europe and ask, can an old fire still burn quietly at the edge of our modern Christmas? The fire has dimmed. The cake has been eaten. The digital embers on our screens loop in silence. And yet, far from city centers and supermarket shelves, there remain places where the Yule log burns in its older form quietly, without spectacle, held not by nostalgia alone but by continuity. In this final section, we venture into those corners of Europe where the smoldering ritual still lingers, where the old symbols are not only remembered but enacted. We will also consider what the Yule log still means in a world that has largely moved beyond seasonal rites. What, if anything, we risk losing when even our warmth becomes symbolic. Survivals in Southern Europe. One of the most surprising havens for the traditional Yule log is not Northern Europe, where the term Yule was born, but the mountains and villages of southern France and northern Spain. The cogatillo of Catalonia. In Catalonia, Spain, the Yule log did not disappear, it evolved, retaining its ritual elements while adapting to a child-friendly form. There the log is known as tio de Nadal, sometimes affectionately called cogatillo, literally, the pooping log. Though jarring in translation, the tradition is deeply beloved and dates back centuries. Here how it works. In early December, children bring a hollow wooden log into the home. It is fed, each night offered food scraps or sweets. The log is also kept warm, often covered with a blanket. Then on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, children sing traditional songs and beat the log with sticks while singing, encouraging it to poop out presents. Underneath the blanket, small gifts, nuts, or candies appear, left by parents, of course, but believed by the children to be produced by the log itself. At first glance, the tradition appears comedic, even absurd, but beneath its humor lies a deeper symbolic core. The log is honored, cared for, warmed. It gives back warmth and food in return. The beating ritual may descend from older percussive fertility rites, where sound and rhythm were used to awaken the land or spirits for the coming season. In a modern sense, the log remains a symbol of giving, of nourishment, and of the reciprocal bond between family and fire. The cacio-fio in Provence. In rural Provence, the Yule log is known as the cacio-fio, meaning log of fire. The tradition, though rare now, survives in some areas. The ritual begins on Christmas Eve, when the oldest and youngest members of the family carry the log into the home together. It is then anointed with wine or oil, sometimes blessed with a sprig of evergreen, and placed gently into the hearth. Before it is lit, the family recites, Cacio-fio vinzi bonheur. Am la plaine di ben, dijunus fag la grace de veilleur elan queven. Log of fire, come and bring happiness. With abundance of good things, may God grant us the grace to see the coming year. The log is meant to burn slowly, ideally lasting through Christmas Day. Ashes from the log are carefully gathered and stored. In some homes, they are scattered over fields to bless the crops. In others, they are kept year-round as a talisman against illness or misfortune. The ritual is not widely practiced anymore, but in isolated pockets of Provence, it remains quiet, understated, familial. The Yule log in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. In the Balkans, particularly Serbia and parts of Bulgaria, a form of Yule log called the badinjak is still burned. The log is cut on Christmas Eve, often ceremonially by the male head of the household. It is decorated with dried fruit, grain, and sprigs of oak or evergreen. Before it is placed in the hearth, prayers are said. In some traditions, coins or honey are rubbed on the bark for luck. The lighting of the badinjak is accompanied by singing, toasts, and a ceremonial meal. The ashes and unburnt pieces are kept, as in Western Europe, for protection and blessing. This tradition, while orthodox in appearance, bears deep pagan roots, tying the return of the sun to the power of flame and timber. In modern Serbian cities, people now burn small bundles of oak twigs instead of full logs. The ritual continues, adapted to apartments and urban hearths. Still, the essence remains: fire, renewal, and reverence for the turning of the year. The psychological role of fire in ritual. Across all these regions, the persistence of the Yule log, whether as a burning trunk, a symbolic bundle, or a log-shaped dessert, reveals something fundamental: the human need for ritual warmth. Fire has always occupied a central place in our collective psyche. It illuminates the dark. It protects from the unknown. It provides a fixed center around which to gather. It is both destructive and generative, consuming fuel to give light and comfort. The Yule log embodies this duality. It is offered, consumed, and remembered. Its ashes are sacred, its flames telling, its lighting ceremonial. In a psychological sense, the Yule log is a rite of transition. It marks the passage from one year to the next, the end of hardship and the hope of renewal. Like the Lord of Misrule in our previous story, it offers a temporary space between death and rebirth, between cold and warmth, between the old and the new. The log in the age of climate control. In the modern world, the burning of a Yule log might seem quaint or even unnecessary. We no longer rely on hearth fires for survival. Climate control, electric lights, and digital entertainment have removed much of the raw need for a communal fire. And yet, what have we lost in its absence? The burning of a Yule log was never just about warmth. It was a gathering point, a shared act, a reminder of continuity through generations. It was tactile, smelly, smoky, slow, the very qualities our modern world rushes to eliminate. When we replace fire with light bulbs, ash with frosting, and ritual with convenience, we may also strip away the sense of rootedness that these traditions once provided. Modern revivals and reenactments. Some communities are beginning to revive the old Yule log traditions not for necessity, but for meaning. Historical reenactments in parts of England and Scandinavia now feature Yule log ceremonies during winter markets. Pagan and neo-Druidic groups incorporate Yule fires into their solstice celebrations. In eco-conscious circles, the idea of gathering around a fire in nature, rather than shopping indoors, is being rediscovered as a form of spiritual grounding. These revivals are small, often symbolic, but they suggest a desire to reconnect with slower, older rhythms of winter and to find warmth that goes beyond central heating. Final reflections. The Yule log once held a unique space in the calendar, a symbol of light in the darkest time, of generosity in scarcity, and of survival through communal ritual. It has since been reshaped, sweetened, and digitized, yet even now a spark remains. In the laughter of Catalan children feeding their wooden log, in the quiet prayers of a Provencal grandmother lighting her cachofio, and even in the flicker of a fireplace video playing in a city apartment, there endures a longing for fire not just as heat, but as connection. Perhaps that is the Yule log's true legacy. Not the shape, not the ash, not even the flame, but the gathering it invites. A moment to pause, to look inward, to remember. Story 3. Telling Ghost Stories by Candlelight, a Victorian Christmas pastime. Whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet round a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. Jerome K. Jerome, Told After Supper, 1891. Today, when we think of Christmas Eve, we picture warm lights, family gatherings, joyful carols, and perhaps a quiet reading of Twas the Night Before Christmas. But not so long ago, a different tradition held court beside the fire, the telling of ghost stories. It might seem strange to the modern mind. Isn't ghostly dread better suited to Halloween? Isn't Christmas a time of joy, not fear? Yet throughout the Victorian era, and into the early 20th century, telling ghost stories by candlelight on Christmas Eve was not only common, it was expected. A genre of its own emerged. The Christmas ghost story, complete with rattling chains, moaning spirits, and cursed old houses. It found its way into serialized magazines, parlor readings, and even children's books. And at the heart of this tradition lies a paradox. Why would the darkest tales be told on the brightest holiday? To answer that, we must venture back into pre-Victorian customs, the psychology of winter, and the quiet tension between death and rebirth that has always haunted midwinter. Darkness, death, and the turning of the year. Before Victorian parlors and serialized fiction, the winter solstice was long regarded as a liminal time, a threshold between worlds. In pre-Christian Europe, the longest night of the year was viewed with equal parts dread and reverence. The earth lay fallow, the animals huddled in barns, the trees were bare. Life was in many ways suspended, and where life waned, spirits were believed to stir. The Wild Hunt, a ghostly procession led by Odin or other mythic figures, was said to ride across the sky in midwinter. In Celtic lands, the time around Yule was one of prophecy and visitation. Samhain, the autumn festival later transformed into Halloween, had its echoes in the depths of winter. The veil between the living and dead, once believed to thin in late autumn, was still thought permeable during the 12 days of Christmas. In short, midwinter was haunted. Even early Christian hagiographies included tales of visions, saintly apparitions, and divine warnings received during the dark months. Thus, the idea of sharing tales of ghosts and strange occurrences during Christmas was not so much an invention as a continuation, a survival of the ancient understanding that the coldest season was also the most spiritually vulnerable. Christmas Eve as the night of superstition. In many rural traditions across Europe, Christmas Eve was believed to be a night of heightened supernatural activity. In Scandinavian lore, animals were said to speak at midnight on Christmas Eve, sharing secrets or warnings, though listening to them was often discouraged. In Germanic traditions, spirits of the dead were believed to revisit homes at Yuletide, especially those of ancestors. In England, Christmas Eve was associated with omens, bees humming in their hives, water turning to wine, and mysterious footprints in the snow. These beliefs weren't necessarily terrifying, they were reflective, sometimes even comforting. They emphasized the thinness of the veil, a time to reconnect with the past, remember the dead, and contemplate mysteries greater than the self. Telling ghost stories became a communal ritual, a way to express fear, wonder, and even yearning, in a form that could be spoken aloud and shared. The rise of the Christmas ghost story in print. By the early 19th century, with the rise of printing technology, literacy, and serialized magazines, ghost stories found a new home: the Christmas issue. Periodicals like All the Year Round, Household Words, and the Illustrated London News published chilling tales every December. These were not horror stories as we think of them today. They were often subtle, atmospheric, and reflective, dwelling on memory, regret, and moral consequences. The most famous example, of course, is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, 1843. Though often remembered as a moral tale of redemption, it is, at its core, a ghost story. 4 specters visit Ebenezer Scrooge. Each is tied to time, memory, and moral accountability. The story unfolds in a single night, Christmas Eve, and reflects a perfect blend of the eerie and the hopeful. Dickens did not invent the Christmas ghost story, but he popularized it. In fact, he published a new Christmas tale nearly every year, often collaborating with other writers like Wilkie Collins, who contributed ghostly installments to his seasonal editions. These stories were read aloud at holiday gatherings, in parlors lit only by firelight or candle. The experience was communal, intimate, and charged with atmosphere. Silence between stories was part of the ritual, an opportunity to feel the quiet tick of the clock, the creak of floorboards, the wind outside. Why Christmas, not Halloween? One might reasonably ask, why not save these ghost stories for October? The answer lies in the meaning of Christmas itself, especially in Victorian culture. While today we emphasize joy, celebration, and consumer rituals, the Victorian Christmas was also a time of introspection. It was a season of death and rebirth, with Christ's birth symbolizing spiritual renewal. But renewal implies decay. New light comes only after darkness. And in that darkness we remember. Ghost stories are, at heart, about memory. They are tales of people who cannot let go or who refuse to be forgotten. A haunting is often triggered by regret, unfinished business, or broken ties. What better time to tell such stories than during a season when families gather, old grievances surface, and absences feel sharper than ever? As one Victorian writer put it, Christmas is the festival of memory, and memory, like a spirit, walks among us. Ghost stories at Christmas were not just about fright. They were about melancholy, longing, and the mysterious persistence of the past. Storytelling as ritual. It's important to remember that for much of history, storytelling was not a passive act. It was performative, collective, and ritualistic. In the Victorian Christmas gathering, stories were told aloud, usually by someone with a gift for atmosphere. Listeners sat close to the fire, shadows dancing on the walls. Each cough or draft of cold air became part of the experience. The stories themselves followed a certain pattern. A first-person narrator, often recalling something from their youth. A quiet setting, an old manor, a country inn, a snowbound house. A slow build, unease before terror. A moral or unresolved ending, the mystery lingers. These were not ghost stories filled with blood or monsters. They were quiet disturbances, unsettling reminders that time is layered and the past is never truly gone. As with the Yule log, the telling mattered as much as the tale. The act of sharing made the fear manageable. Listeners were wrapped in both story and blanket, fear and comfort. Unfinished reflections. Why did we stop telling ghost stories at Christmas? Was it a cultural shift towards sentimentality, a loss of interest in the past? Or did modernity, with its electric lights and indoor heating, simply make shadows less mysterious? We will explore how the Christmas ghost story faded from public consciousness, and examine the deeper emotional needs it once served and may still serve beneath the tinsel and commercial cheer. In parlors across Victorian England, the flicker of gaslight or candle flame once signaled the beginning of an evening tradition, the reading or recitation of a ghost story. Yet by the 20th century, this seasonal ritual had largely faded from memory. The fire still burned, the Christmas tree still stood, but the hush that once preceded the telling of eerie tales had been replaced by other forms of holiday entertainment. Carols on the radio, Christmas films, party games, or the quiet hum of electric bulbs. What happened to this chilling yet cherished tradition? In this section, we trace the slow decline of the Christmas ghost story from its height in the serialized pages of Victorian magazines to its gradual disappearance in the face of modernity. We'll also explore how this shift reflects broader changes in how we deal with memory, community, and the darkness beneath celebration. From hearth to page to market. At the core of the Victorian ghost story tradition was the printed word. Journals like Household Words, edited by Charles Dickens, all the year round, and later publications like The Strand and Pearson's Magazine, made ghost stories accessible to the growing literate middle class. Every Christmas, readers expected ghostly tales among the recipes, sermons, and holiday essays. These were rarely horrifying in the modern sense. They were tales of unease, tinged with morality and melancholy. But as the 19th century ended and the early 20th century began, the nature of print media and the holiday itself began to change. 1. The rise of Christmas sentimentality. Following the publication and immense popularity of A Christmas Carol, Dickens himself contributed to a rebranding of Christmas as a holiday of family, redemption, and warmth. What began as a ghost story ended in transformation and joy. Over time, this redemptive model dominated the season's narratives. Stories of reflection and social conscience, whether ghostly or not, became more popular than stories of spectral revenge or tragic hauntings. As the holiday became more commercialized, publishers increasingly favored uplifting stories, often centered on children, miracles, or acts of kindness. Ghosts, if they appeared, became softer, less terrifying, more instructive. By the 1910s and 1920s, most Christmas-themed publications had shifted away from the spectral entirely. 2. Technological changes. The turn of the 20th century also ushered in new forms of entertainment. Electricity altered the domestic atmosphere. Candlelit shadows gave way to uniform brightness. The strange charm of flickering light and creaking floors was dulled by the hum of modern convenience. The radio, rising in the 1920s and 1930s, brought music, news, and comedy into the home. Rather than creating entertainment, families increasingly consumed it. Cinema, likewise, drew people out of their homes and into theaters for communal experiences of a different kind, spectacle, rather than storytelling. Ghost stories, once a performative ritual, lost their preferred setting. A quiet room, the hush of listeners, the authority of a teller. The loss of the communal hearth. As discussed in the previous story on the Yule log, the central hearth, that focal point of family life, was slowly replaced by radiators, stoves, and eventually central heating. Along with it faded the natural gathering point for storytelling. In Victorian homes, even into the Edwardian period, Christmas was one of the few times when extended families gathered under one roof. Evening amusements were homemade: charades, singing, and storytelling. The ghost story had a place because there was a space for it. But by the 1940s and 1950s, family gatherings had become shorter, smaller, and increasingly dominated by external entertainment radio shows, holiday programming, and, eventually, television. The role of the storyteller, often an elder or a well-read guest, faded. In its place came recorded voices, moving images, and eventually, screen-dominated evenings. The shared silence of a haunting tale, broken only by the wind outside or the crack of burning logs, became a thing of the past. Fear in a new context. Another reason for the decline of ghost stories at Christmas lies in the changing cultural context of fear. In the 19th century, ghost stories offered a controlled confrontation with mortality, uncertainty, and grief. They were reflective, not shocking. They whispered rather than screamed. But the 20th century brought with it real horrors: 2 world wars, genocide, the Great Depression, nuclear fear. Against such a backdrop, the gentle eeriness of the Victorian ghost story may have seemed too quaint or too much of a reminder. Writers turned to more visceral forms of horror. The genre fragmented. Weird fiction, championed by authors like H.P. Lovecraft and Algernon Blackwood, shifted horror into cosmic realms. Psychological thrillers and detective fiction replaced many traditional ghostly tales in public favor. Horror films, beginning with silent classics like Nosferatu and maturing with talkies like Dracula, 1931, made ghosts visible, something the quiet parlor tales never tried to do. By the time horror had been fully visualized on screen, the delicate atmosphere of the Christmas ghost story had become an antique curiosity. Survivals in tradition. Still, the Christmas ghost story never vanished entirely. It simply retreated into certain corners, kept alive by enthusiasts, collectors, and a few curious institutions. 1. M.R. James and the Cambridge tradition. One of the few writers who kept the tradition alive into the 20th century was Montague Rhodes James, a scholar and antiquarian who served as provost of King's College, Cambridge. Between 1890 and 1935, James penned a series of short ghost stories that were deliberately written to be read aloud at Christmas to friends and students. His tales, such as "Oh, Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad and the Mezzotint," were steeped in atmosphere, ambiguity, and scholarly mystery. James's stories didn't rely on shock. They unsettled. They evoked unease through suggestion, silence, and slow realization. His tradition of Christmas readings, though not widely known to the public, maintained the original structure of the Christmas ghost story: communal, quiet, and unsettling. 2. BBC Ghost Story for Christmas. Beginning in the 1970s, the BBC launched a series of televised dramas under the banner A Ghost Story for Christmas. Many were adaptations of M.R. James' work. These broadcasts, typically aired in the days just before Christmas, attempted to recapture the moody packing and period atmosphere of the older tailies. Though they were not blockbusters, they found an appreciative audience and created a small but enduring Christmas tradition for British viewers. In recent years, the BBC has revived the format, producing new stories in a similar tone. Yet even these are niche offerings, far removed from the cultural ubiquity of Dickens or modern Christmas films. What we lost. The fading of the Christmas ghost story marks more than the end of a literary trend. It reflects a loss of communal intimacy, a shift in how we process fear, and perhaps a declining willingness to sit with silence. These stories served a function. They acknowledged absence ghosts often stood in for those no longer present. They invited reflection, drawing attention to the passage of time, the weight of regret, the fragility of life. They held a space for fear, not to shock, but to share, to make it manageable through collective experience. Modern Christmas often denies these emotions. The emphasis is on joy, celebration, and forward momentum, but beneath the tinsel and lights, people still grieve. They still remember, and in that remembered darkness, perhaps, there is still a place for the ghost. Unfinished reflections. Can the ghost story return to Christmas? Not as spectacle or nostalgic reenactment, but as a living, relevant part of how we experience the season. We'll explore the modern efforts to revive the Christmas ghost story, the surprising ways the tradition survives in literature and media, and how embracing seasonal eeriness might bring depth and honesty back to our holiday reflections. The ghost story, like the ghost itself, has never truly died. It lingers. It watches from the corners of our culture. And just as a long-forgotten name might be whispered in an empty hallway, the tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas has begun to re-emerge quietly, but unmistakably. It no longer holds the central place it once did in the Victorian parlor. You're less likely to find it in the Christmas issue of a mainstream magazine. But in books, television, podcasts, and even gatherings by candlelight, the old ritual is slowly flickering back to life. In this final section, we examine the modern revival of the Christmas ghost story, what its return tells us about our emotional needs during the holiday season, and how this ancient tradition might offer not only entertainment, but comfort in an age of distraction and loss. A literary return. Over the past 2 decades, small presses and niche publishers have begun to resurrect the seasonal ghost story, particularly in the United Kingdom. Often inspired by M.R. James and Dickens, these collections blend old and new, offering tales both nostalgic and unnerving. Examples of modern Christmas ghost collections. Ghosts of Christmas Past, British Library Publishing, features both classic Victorian tales and contemporary editions, curated to reflect the genre's evolution. Swan River Press in Dublin has published beautifully bound editions of obscure ghost stories, once read aloud at Christmas salons. Valancourt Books, known for reviving forgotten horror and gothic fiction, released Victorian Christmas ghost stories, showcasing the depth of the genre beyond Dickens. These books, often released in November or early December, are deliberately seasonal, designed to be read by the fire or, more often now, by bedside lamp with a sense of quiet immersion. They are not simply reprints. Many are accompanied by scholarly introductions, notes on the history of the tradition, and gentle encouragement to share the stories aloud, as they once were. Broadcast and screen adaptations. While television largely abandoned the Christmas ghost story during the mid-20th century in favor of feel-good family fare, recent years have seen a tentative return. 1. The BBC's A Ghost Story for Christmas, resurrected. After a long hiatus, the BBC revived its Ghost Story for Christmas tradition in the 2000s, with new adaptations of classic tales. Mark Gatiss, best known for Sherlock and Doctor Who, has become a champion of the genre. He has adapted multiple M.R. James stories for Christmas television, including The Mezzotint and Count Magnus. These adaptations are restrained, period-accurate, and deeply atmospheric, designed not to terrify, but to unsettle. They are filmed with care, evoking the slow dread and silence that define the tradition. The BBC continues to air these stories in the week before Christmas, usually late at night, a modern version of the parlor hush. 2. Streaming and audio revivals. In a digital twist on an oral tradition, podcasts and audiobooks have become key platforms for the Christmas ghost story. The Magnus Archives, Uncanny and Haunted, are year-round paranormal podcasts that often release Christmas specials, many of them inspired by historical formats. The Folklore Podcast, hosted by historian Mark Norman, explores the historical context of seasonal hauntings. Narrators on YouTube like Let's Read or Creepy Ghost Stories release Christmas Eve specials, reviving old tales for new listeners. These formats capture something essential: the voice in the dark, the rhythm of a tale unfolding in shared silence. In many ways, they bring the tradition full circle once again, prioritizing the listener's imagination over spectacle. Live events and modern parlor readings. In some corners of the world, people are once again gathering in person to tell ghost stories at Christmas, echoing the fireside rituals of the 1800s. In the UK, heritage organizations like the National Trust host readings of M.R. James stories in historic manor houses by candlelight. The atmosphere is carefully cultivated. No electric lighting, minimal noise, audience seated in the round. Bookstores and libraries have hosted Ghosts by the Fire events, especially during the solstice season. Some invite attendees to bring their own stories, reviving not only published tales but family lore. Storytelling groups across the U.S. and Canada have begun exploring ghostlit Christmases, combining folk music, poetry, and ghostly narrative into community events. These are small-scale efforts, but they speak to a larger truth. People still crave slow, shared experiences, especially at Christmas. Why we still need ghost stories at Christmas. The reemergence of this tradition is not just a nostalgic trend. It reflects a deeper emotional and psychological need, one that modern celebrations often overlook. One ghost says memory. At Christmas, we remember. We remember those not with us. We revisit childhood homes, family rituals, and old regrets. Ghost stories at their core are not about fear, they are about persistence. The past refuses to stay buried. In this sense, ghosts symbolize what we carry: love, loss, mistakes, lessons. Christmas is a natural setting for this kind of reflection. 2. Darkness needs a place. In a culture that prizes cheer and light, many feel pressured to be happy during the holidays. But the season can also bring grief, loneliness, and introspection. Ghost stories validate these emotions. They acknowledge that not everything is merry and bright. They make space for discomfort and, in doing so, offer comfort. As scholar Sarah Juliet Lauro notes, ghost stories at Christmas remind us that death is part of the season, that light is only meaningful because of the dark. 3. A return to silence. Telling a ghost story requires silence, not just quiet, but attention, presence. In an age of noise, distraction, and screen scrolling, this is itself radical. Sitting together, listening to a voice in the dark, imagining shadows that aren't there, this is a ritual that connects us, not only to one another, but to the older rhythms of the year. Inviting the ghost back in. To tell a ghost story at Christmas is not to summon terror, but to welcome mystery. It is to sit with ambiguity, with memory, with time itself. The tradition invites us to slow down, reflect on who and what is past. Remember that celebration and sorrow are not opposites, but companions. Perhaps, then, the return of this tradition is not just about reviving a genre, but about reviving a depth that modern Christmas sometimes lacks. A final reflection. When Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, he did not merely revive the ghost story, he redefined it. His spirits weren't monsters, they were memories, warnings, and second chances. He understood something timeless, that to sit in the dark and to hear a ghost speak is not to be frightened. It is to listen for what we've forgotten. And perhaps this Christmas, whether by firelight or headphone, you might do the same. Story 4. The Christmas Boar's Head Feast, Fables, and Forgotten Roasts. The Christmas feast is a symbol of warmth, abundance, and community, a table groaning under the weight of roasted meats, spiced puddings, and flowing drink. In today's festive settings, the centerpiece might be a golden turkey, a glazed ham, or a vegetarian roast. But in medieval and Tudor England, one dish reigned supreme, not just as a meal but as a ritual spectacle: the boar's head. Served with its mouth open, often holding an apple or an orange between its tusks, and surrounded by herbs and song, the boar's head was more than a roast. It was a symbol of conquest, fertility, honor, and seasonal inversion. For several centuries, it was the undisputed centerpiece of elite Christmas banquets, especially among royalty, nobles, and prestigious academic institutions. But where did this tradition come from? Why a boar and not a deer or a cow? And what did it mean to carry this fearsome animal's head to the table on Christmas Day? To answer these questions, we must look back to a time when hunting was holy, pigs were dangerous, and feasting was inseparable from ceremony. Wild boars and sacred feast. The wild boar, Sus scrofa, was once widespread across Europe, including the dense forests of England and Wales. Unlike modern domestic pigs, wild boars were strong, fast, and ferocious. With sharp tusks and a muscular build, they were among the most dangerous game animals a person could hunt, especially before the invention of firearms. To successfully kill a wild boar required more than luck. It demanded skill, bravery, and, often, cooperation with trained hounds. It is not surprising, then, that the boar became a symbol of virility, nobility, and martial prowess. In many pagan traditions, the boar was sacred. To the Celts, it was associated with gods of war and fertility. In Norse mythology, the god Freya rode a golden boar named Gullinbursti. Even in Roman contexts, the boar was a symbol of strength and divine favor, appearing on military standards and coins. When midwinter festivals took place, whether Saturnalia, Yule, or solstice feasts, the boar was often sacrificed and eaten in communal ceremonies. Its meat, rich and fatty, was especially welcome in winter, and its offering was symbolic of life, death, and renewal. With the Christianization of Europe, many pagan customs were absorbed and reshaped. The boar's head, once a sacrificial offering to gods or ancestors, now appeared on the Christmas table as a ritual centerpiece, both culinary and ceremonial. The boar's head in English tradition. By the 14th century, the boar's head had become firmly embedded in English Christmas celebrations, particularly among the nobility and the gentry. In aristocratic homes, the boar's head was the first course served at Christmas feasts, often with elaborate ceremony. The custom reached its most elaborate form in Tudor England, where Christmas was a time of theatrical display. Under Henry VIII, feasts were not simply meals, they were events, filled with pageantry, music, and symbolic gestures. The arrival of the boar's head was usually announced by trumpets or heralds. It was carried in by servants dressed in festive livery. A carol was sung, the most famous being the Boar's Head Carol, which still survives today. The boar's head in hand bear I, bedecked with bays and rosemary. I pray you, my masters, be merry. Quod estis in convivio. This Latin refrain, quod estis in convivio, translates to, because you are at the feast. It emphasized the celebratory, ritualistic nature of the moment. The boar's head wasn't just a meal, it was an offering to the feast itself, a symbolic host in the room. The head was frequently adorned with bays, laurel leaves, for honor, rosemary for remembrance, and sometimes gilded tusks or jewels for added pageantry. The Oxford tradition. Perhaps the most enduring example of this ritual survives in Oxford University, where the Queen's College Boar's Head feast continues to this day, though now with a symbolic head rather than a real one. The story behind this tradition is a curious blend of scholarly satire and medieval legend. As the tale goes, a student of Queen's College, while walking through the woods, was attacked by a wild boar. Unarmed, he fought the animal with what he had, a copy of Aristotle. As the boar lunged, he is said to have rammed the book into its open mouth, choking it on classical philosophy. The absurd heroism of this tale, mixing academic pride with knightly valor, was soon immortalized in the college's traditions. Every Christmas, a boar's head was brought in with pomp, and the Boar's Head Carol was sung with gusto. Though the actual feast has been modernized, the symbolism endures. Intellect conquers brute force, tradition carries forward. Preparation and presentation. The boar's head in practice was not easy to prepare. These were not farm-raised pigs. They were wild, muscular, and sinewy. The head itself required slow cooking, pickling, or roasting over several hours, sometimes days. In Tudor kitchens, the head was typically parboiled, then roasted and garnished heavily to disguise the more grotesque aspects. The jaws were often propped open with fruit apples, lemons, or oranges, and the snout decorated with cloves. The symbolism of the apple in the mouth likely derives from earlier fertility and harvest rites. In later Christian imagery, it also evokes the fall of man in Eden, adding a subtle theological weight to the dish. The beast tamed by fruit, sin devoured by fire. Boar's head in Christmas as spectacle. The inclusion of the boar's head in a feast was not merely culinary, it was about theater, power, and seasonal symbolism. It reminded guests of the host's wealth and hunting rights, since wild boar hunting required land, servants, and time. It served as a visual climax to the gathering, reinforcing hierarchy and seasonal inversion. It connected the present meal to the ancient past, both classical and pagan. As such, the boar's head joined other symbolic foods like the peacock pie, the marchpane castle, and the flaming plum pudding as a dish meant to be seen as much as eaten. But as time passed, even this mighty roast began to fade. The slow disappearance. By the 17th century, the wild boar was becoming rare in England. Habitat loss, overhunting, and the expansion of agriculture pushed boars to near extinction on the British Isles. At the same time, culinary tastes began to change. Roast beef, turkey, and more manageable domestic pigs took the place of their wild cousins. The elaborate ceremonies of the Tudor feast gave way to more restrained, though still hearty, celebrations. By the 18th century, the boar's head had become mostly symbolic. Even when served, it was often from a domestic pig or prepared ahead of time and posed decoratively. The full ceremony survived only in a few institutions and slowly passed into antiquarian curiosity. Unfinished reflections. Why did the boar's head command such reverence for so long? Was it the beast itself, the danger of the hunt, the honor of the kill, or something deeper? Was the Christmas feast once a kind of theater in which man, nature, and the divine all played their parts? We will explore the cultural and mythological symbolism of the boar in European and Christian contexts, and how the animal's image came to embody sacrifice, fertility, and even the struggle between light and darkness at the turning of the year. In the grand halls of medieval England, where the scent of spices mingled with burning yew logs and heavy tapestries muffled winter's chill, the boar's head emerged not simply as food but as icon. Gilded, garlanded, and carried with pride, it was a symbol layered with meaning: pagan memory, Christian reimagination, and seasonal triumph woven into flesh and bone. In this section, we move beyond the table and into the symbolic landscape of the boar, exploring how this creature became a central figure in ancient myth, religious thought, and seasonal ceremony. Why the boar? Why not the stag, the ox, or the lamb? The answers lie in its ferocity, its liminal power, and its sacrificial resonance. The boar in myth and pagan ritual. Before it appeared on the table, the boar roamed the forests of mythology. Celtic and Norse roots. In Celtic traditions, the boar was sacred to various deities, especially gods of war, the hunt, and prophecy. Carvings and relics from Gaul and Britain depict boars in contexts that suggest veneration. The animal was not only hunted but also offered, both as a sacrifice and as a symbol of divine strength. In Welsh myth, the tale of Culhwch and Olwen includes the boar Twrchtr, a monstrous creature hunted by King Arthur and his knights. The boar is intelligent, nearly supernatural, and its defeat is an act of epic bravery. In Norse mythology, the boar appears in elevated company. The god Freya, associated with fertility and kingship, rides Gullinbursti, a golden-bristled boar forged by dwarves. Another boar, Sihrimnir, is slaughtered and reborn each night in Valhalla, providing the eternal feast for fallen warriors. These stories share a thread. The boar is powerful, untamed, and sacred. It embodies the liminal space between civilization and wilderness, control and chaos, life and death. This symbolic tension made it the perfect creature for seasonal rituals, especially those concerned with winter's peril and spring's promise. Boar sacrifice and the winter solstice. Many ancient midwinter festivals involved animal sacrifice. In Germanic Yule traditions, a boar was offered to Freya as a fertility rite. Participants swore oaths on its bristles, an act of binding truth to beast. The meat was then consumed in a communal feast. This ritual did several things at once: acknowledged the gods through sacrifice, bound the community through shared meat and oaths, symbolized the sun's return by slaying the wild boar as chaos, allowing the new year to begin. Thus, the boar became not only a symbol of danger, but also a token of rebirth. Its death brought protection, renewal, and social order. When Christianity spread across Europe, such traditions were not wholly eradicated. They were absorbed, reshaped, and given new layers of meaning. Christian reinterpretation of the boar. The early church often repurposed pagan symbols to fit Christian narratives. The boar, once a sacred beast of fertility and strength, was gradually reframed as a symbol of sin, pride, and bestial temptation, but one that could be defeated and transformed. The boar's head at Christmas became a Christianized echo of the older sacrificial rite. It was no longer an offering to pagan gods, but rather a testament to victory over nature, over sin, over death. In this context, the carving and consumption of the boar's head at Christmas mirrored the spiritual idea of dominion over the beastly self. The apple in the mouth, evocative of Eden, reminded diners of original sin now redeemed through the death of the animal. The placement of rosemary, a symbol of remembrance and fidelity, served to bless the household and hallow the ritual. The boar's head thus became a fusion of pagan vitality and Christian morality, a symbol with deep resonance in the seasonal calendar. The boar as a seasonal symbol. Christmas, placed near the winter solstice, has always been a feast of paradox: death and birth, darkness and light, silence and song. The boar fits this framework perfectly. It represents the chaos of winter, untamed and potentially deadly. The hunt, an act of dominance over that chaos. The feast, where danger is transformed into nourishment. The return of order, with the animal now tamed, plated, and presented under control. In killing and feasting on the boar, communities enacted a ritual conquest of darkness, a triumph that paved the way for the symbolic birth of light, both solar and spiritual. The boar, then, was not merely a roast, it was a story eaten together. Fables and folklore, legends of the boar. The boar has also stalked the pages of medieval fables and local legends, often as a creature of hubris and poetic justice. One of the most enduring tales is the boar of Windsor Forest, a creature so large and vicious that only the most courageous knight could slay it. Another is the wild boar of Westmoreland, which terrorized villages until it was finally brought down by a humble yeoman, proof that courage, not rank, was the true test of nobility. In many of these tales, the boar is not just a beast, it is a moral obstacle, a test of one's strength or character. Its defeat is celebrated not because it ends danger, but because it confirms identity of the hero, the host, the household. When a boar's head arrived at a feast, it invoked these stories. Guests were not just eating meat, they were participating in a symbolic act of triumph. Women and the boar, subtle subversions. Interestingly, while the boar was often associated with masculine virtue, strength, courage, aggression, some stories used it to challenge those ideas. In certain ballads and plays, a woman slays the boar not through brute force, but with cleverness or kindness. One version tells of a maiden who tames a boar by feeding it berries and singing to it, leading it quietly to the village where the men had failed. These tales remind us that the boar, and the rituals around it, could be used to invert as well as enforce social expectations, much like other Christmas customs involving misrule and reversal. The boar's heraldic afterlife. Though no longer served at feasts, the boar lived on in another form, heraldry. The white boar was the personal badge of King Richard III, used to assert his lineage and ferocity. Many noble families included boar heads or full boars on their crests, signifying valor in the hunt, strength in battle, or loyalty in governance. In Scotland, where the wild boar survived longer, it became a national symbol of resilience and defiance. Even as the real animal disappeared from forests and menus, its image persisted, reminding those who bore it of a time when danger could be roasted and triumph served on a platter. Unfinished reflections. Was the boar's head merely a feast or a ritualized myth made edible? When we dined on the boar, were we feeding the body or the story? We will trace the final decline of the boar's head tradition, its replacement by tamer holiday fare, and ask whether today's Christmas meals, divorced from myth and danger, still offer the communal power once found in tusk and fire. A centuries-old roast, once carried into great halls with trumpets, song, and splendor, now exists primarily as a line in a forgotten carol or a decorative centerpiece made of marzipan. The boar's head, once a majestic and fearsome symbol of Christmas power, has long since been replaced by domestic turkeys, honey-glazed hams, or entirely meatless alternatives. But the boar's disappearance from the holiday table is not merely a culinary footnote. It marks a shift in seasonal meaning, in social structure, and in how we understand the role of ritual food in collective life. This final section explores the slow fading of the boar's head tradition in England and beyond, the emergence of new Christmas centerpiece dishes, and how these changes reflect deeper trends: urbanization, industrialization, changing palates, and the domestication of symbolism. The decline of the hunt and the end of the boar. One of the earliest and most straightforward reasons for the disappearance of the boar's head from the Christmas table was practical. The boar itself vanished. By the late 17th century, wild boar had been hunted to extinction in Britain. With the expansion of agriculture and the enclosure of forests, there was little remaining habitat for large, dangerous animals. Wild boar hunting had already become the preserve of aristocrats. As populations dwindled, even they turned to other game. While imported boars or domestic pigs could stand in, the symbolism lost its edge. A fat farm pig was not the same as the untamed beast of the woods. The roast became less about conquest, more about convenience. By the 18th century, references to boars' heads at Christmas became increasingly symbolic, ornamental, or relics of institutional tradition, as at Oxford's Queen's College. The roaring of fire and song gave way to more genteel domestic fare. The rise of the Christmas turkey. The shift toward turkey as the dominant Christmas roast marks a broader culinary and social transition. Imported to England from the Americas in the 16th century, the turkey was initially a novelty, exotic, large, and ideal for feeding a crowd. By the 18th century, it had become a staple among wealthier households, and by the Victorian period, it was widely available thanks to improvements in transport and animal husbandry. The turkey's appeal was manifold. It was impressive, but less threatening than a boar. It fed many, but didn't require hours of ceremonial preparation. It was domestic, neatly fitting into the rhythm of modern kitchen life. Charles Dickens famously wrote in A Christmas Carol, 1843, of the Cratchits enjoying a modest goose later, upgraded to a prized turkey sent by Scrooge. In doing so, he helped to codify the bird as the Victorian ideal of Christmas plenty. Where the boar once symbolized fear mastered and wilderness subdued, the turkey signaled prosperity, order, and comfort. The ritual drama of the feast was no longer focused on overcoming danger, but on gracious hosting and moral redemption. Changing palates and the democratization of the feast. By the 19th century, Christmas meals began to reflect not just class but changing cultural values. The feast was now about nostalgia, domestic warmth, moral storytelling, largely shaped by Dickens and his contemporaries. The boar's head, with its violent past and ceremonial grandeur, felt out of step. It belonged to another age, one of armored huntsmen, high church processions, and Tudor revels. It was too messy, too ancient, too symbolic. Victorian cookbooks rarely featured it. When they did, it was with heavy disclaimers, for presentation only, or rarely undertaken today. At the same time, new traditions arose: Christmas pudding, mince pies, stuffed fowl, spiced punch, each with symbolic roots, but all less martial, more middle class. The boar's head in institutional memory. Though it vanished from the domestic table, the boar's head lived on in ritualized form in a few places. Queen's College, Oxford. As previously mentioned, the boar's head feast continues annually at Queen's College, Oxford, where the head is paraded in procession, now typically a replica, or a carefully prepared domestic pig's head accompanied by the traditional boar's head carol. This event has become a ceremonial link to the past, more about continuity and pageantry than sustenance. Festivals and reenactments. In a handful of medieval fairs, Christmas markets, and historical reenactments, the boar's head makes appearances as a centerpiece of spectacle, not of appetite. In these settings, it is not consumed, but displayed, a fossil of a custom once meaningful, now mostly decorative. Still, in these rare appearances, it evokes awe, and perhaps a flicker of unease, reminding viewers that once, this was a thing of real blood and danger, not papier-mâché and garlands. The loss of the ritual meal. The story of the boar's head is ultimately a story about the disappearance of the ritual feast, where food is not only nourishment, but narrative. In many pre-modern societies, certain meals held cosmic meaning. The Passover lamb in Jewish tradition. The Eucharistic bread and wine in Christianity. The midwinter roast in solstice rites. The boar's head feast was one such meal, a myth enacted in meat, where the death of the beast marked the rebirth of the year. Modern holiday meals still carry echoes of ritual: carving the turkey, lighting the pudding, toasting the season, but often lack the deep, symbolic coherence that older societies preserved. In replacing the boar, we may have gained comfort but lost a certain gravitas. The feast no longer slays the monster, it simply satisfies the guest. Modern revivals and echoes. Though the boar's head is unlikely to return to everyday tables, echoes of its tradition remain. The apple in the mouth persists in some ham or pig roasts, a visual callback to earlier symbolism. High-end chefs occasionally reconstruct Tudor feasts, including boar's head, for novelty or education. Some folk-heavy Christmas celebrations in Europe include symbolic references to wild boar as part of winter tailies. There's also a growing interest in reconnecting food with meaning, whether through slow food movements, ancestral cooking, or ritual eating. These modern efforts, while not centered on boars, share the goal once served by the boar's head feast: to commune, not just consume. A final reflection. The boar's head once led the Christmas feast not because it was easy, but because it was meaningful. It demanded respect, preparation, and ritual. Its presence reminded diners of the thin line between danger and joy, winter and rebirth, beast and man. Its absence is not just about a changing diet. It marks the loss of a kind of ceremonial consciousness, one in which even a roast could tell a story. Perhaps that story still matters. Even now, as we set our holiday tables with safe and familiar fare, there is value in remembering the meals that once carried myth on their shoulders and tusks on their plates. Story 5. Cabbage Night and Christmas Mischief in Colonial America. When we picture colonial America at Christmas time, the dominant image is one of simplicity: modest firesides, scripture reading, and perhaps a carefully prepared meal of local game and root vegetables. But for many 18th and early 19th century communities, Christmas wasn't only a time of reflection or religious observation, it was also a season of mischief, noise, and controlled lawlessness. Long before trick-or-treaters rang doorbells in October, Cabbage Night and its many regional variants was one of the rowdiest and most misunderstood parts of the winter holiday calendar in early America. Though now more associated with Halloween in parts of the northeastern United States, its roots stretch back to the Old World tradition of misrule. And in the early colonies, this type of wintertime disruption often centered around Christmas, not Halloween. In this story, we will examine the little-remembered but once widespread practice of Yuletide pranks and street-level rebellion in colonial and early American life. The focus here is not on war, revolution, or founding fathers, but on ordinary youths, servants, and apprentices who used the holiday season as a time to flip the world upside down, if only for a night. What was Cabbage Night? The name Cabbage Night has long been associated with October 30th, particularly in New England and upstate New York, where it became a localized tradition of Halloween mischief. But its origins are murkier and older, and in colonial America, similar events occurred not only in the fall but throughout the Christmas season, especially during the 12 days of Christmas. In fact, in some places, the night of December 24th, or even New Year's Eve, was when the real mischief unfolded. Young men and boys, often in groups, would engage in activities that ranged from light-hearted pranks to full-scale harassment of local authority figures. The term Cabbage Night itself may derive from a tradition of raiding local gardens, particularly for withered cabbages or turnips, and using them as projectiles or props in acts of mockery. Common acts of Christmas mischief included revering signposts or removing gates, banging on doors or windows, often late into the night, soaping windows, throwing corn or stealing fence rails, borrowing carts or wagons and moving them to strange locations, singing rude or satirical songs beneath windows, something akin to a negative form of caroling, While these pranks were often brushed off as harmless, they carried deep echoes of older, ritualized misrule, the idea that, once a year, order could be turned upside down. Old World origins of Yuletide mischief. The cultural DNA of Cabbage Night can be traced back to medieval European customs, particularly in England and Germany, where Christmas and the 12 days were often marked by processions, mock rituals, and noisy inversion of social roles. This included the Lord of Misrule, who presided over Christmas revels, see Story 1. Mumming, in which disguised performers would enter homes and act out scenes or sing, sometimes demanding food or money. Wassailing, which began as a form of blessing orchards, but evolved into house-to-house drinking and carousing. Colonists brought these customs with them to the New World. But in America, where ecclesiastical authority was often stricter, especially in Puritan New England, these traditions took on a more subversive flavor. Forbidden from engaging in certain kinds of holiday celebrations, young people adapted their energy and satire into forms that blended folk rebellion with seasonal high spirits. Mischief became a way to assert agency, especially in communities where power was tightly held by religious or political elites. The role of youth and class. In colonial towns and early American villages, age and class hierarchy were rigid and closely monitored. Apprentices, servants, laborers, and enslaved people had little recourse for expression, and few sanctioned outlets for frustration or defiance. The winter season, when work slowed, nights lengthened, and supervision loosened, created a liminal space for disruptive behavior. Cabbage Night and its related forms allowed young men, in particular, to engage in ritualized acts of mockery. Targets were often figures of authority, the local school teacher, magistrate, minister, or any landowner known for stinginess. While violence was rare, there was a menacing edge to the mischief. Doors were rattled, furniture upended, fences disassembled, and insults hurled under the veil of group anonymity. This was not just mischief, it was social theater, a way of saying, "We see you, we can laugh at you, tonight you cannot touch us." In many cases, communities tolerated this behavior as part of the seasonal rhythm. As long as it didn't escalate, it was expected, and even occasionally encouraged by older men who remembered their own nights of cabbage flinging. Caroling or coercion, the threat behind the song. One closely related practice was rough music, or noisy caroling, a hybrid between traditional Christmas singing and public shamming. Bands of carolers might perform bawdy parodies of religious songs outside the homes of unpopular individuals. Refusing to reward the group with food, drink, or coins could invite reprisals: a cracked window, a broken gate, or worse. This tradition bears resemblance to charivari in France or skimmington rides, in England, events in which communities used noise, song, and spectacle to mock or regulate social behavior, often targeting adulterers, drunkards, or cruel landlords. At Christmas, these rituals took on a different tone. One part celebration, one part revenge fantasy, dressed in evergreen and snow. In this way, Cabbage Night mischief was not isolated. It was part of a constellation of informal justice systems, rooted in folklore, that existed alongside formal law. Tension with religious authorities. Not surprisingly, religious leaders, especially among the Puritans and early Congregationalists, condemned these winter antics. Sermons warned against ungodly singing and revelry, nocturnal raids and tomfoolery, the abuse of sacred nights with idleness and drink. In some towns, ordinances were passed forbidding groups from gathering in the streets on Christmas Eve or New Year's. Curfews were enacted, watchmen were posted. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. In tight-knit towns, local magistrates were often reluctant to punish their own sons or neighbors' children. And so, the tradition continued shifting, evolving, but rarely disappearing. a mischief of many names. While Cabbage Night became the most well-known name in later years, particularly in New York and New Jersey, similar Christmas misrule went by many other names depending on region and ethnicity. Belsnickling in Pennsylvania Dutch communities, going mummering in Newfoundland and parts of Appalachia, Skimmington rides or rough music in the American South, Santa Claus raids in parts of the Midwest. Each variation preserved the core idea. During the holiday season, rules could bend and sometimes break. Unfinished reflections. Why were these acts of misrule allowed, even cherished, for so long in early American life? Were they just youthful rebellion or a deeper form of social release in a rigid world? What does it mean that we remember Christmas as a time of peace, when it was once a time of simmering chaos and overturned norms? We'll trace the evolution of Christmas mischief in America, how it shifted from communal release to criminal behavior, how Halloween inherited its rituals, and how changing attitudes toward youth and order turned a cabbage into a crime. The flickering line between custom and crime, between sanctioned mischief and outright lawlessness, began to sharpen as America moved from its colonial roots toward the early republic and then into the Victorian era. What was once viewed as seasonal misrule, expected and even cherished, came to be seen as immature at best and dangerous at worst. In this section, we follow the evolution and decline of Christmas-centered mischief in American towns and cities. We examine how changing attitudes toward youth, authority, social class, and public order shifted the cultural framing of these once tolerated traditions. We also explore how the spirit of Christmas misrule migrated into other holidays, especially Halloween, and ask what was lost when the old rhythms of ritual release were replaced by the discipline of the modern calendar. The changing shape of society. In the colonial era, society was largely rural. Towns were small, hierarchies were visible, and behavior, however disruptive, was bounded by shared experience. But by the early 1800s, urbanization brought new concerns. Cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were growing rapidly, fueled by immigration, industrialization, and economic opportunity. With more people came less cohesion, and with less cohesion came greater anxiety about public order. Noise, drunkenness, and youthful disorder, once viewed as seasonal annoyances, were increasingly treated as threats to stability. Wintertime mischief, including that during Christmas, began to provoke stronger responses from authorities. In some cases, this took the form of increased policing. In others, it became part of moral reform movements, which sought to align Christmas with Christian piety, family values, and sobriety. The once ambiguous space for misrule was steadily shrinking. The moralization of Christmas. One of the most decisive shifts occurred during the mid-19th century, when Protestant religious leaders and civic reformers began to reimagine Christmas. Rather than a rowdy public holiday filled with boisterous celebration and youthful antics, Christmas was rebranded as a quiet, domestic affair. It became a time for reflection, charity, child-centered innocence, and middle-class order. This transformation was encouraged by the publication of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, 1843, which helped recast the holiday as an occasion for moral redemption and social responsibility. The rise of the nuclear family, with an emphasis on the hearth and home rather than the street or tavern. Women's increasing role in shaping holiday customs, particularly in cultivating family rituals, gift-giving, and temperate behavior. In this new Christmas ideal, there was no room for cabbage-shucking apprentices or nighttime gate removers. Those who persisted in these behaviors were no longer mischievous, they were delinquents. Mischief becomes crime. By the late 1800s, urban newspapers were filled with warnings about rowdy boys, holiday disturbances, and destructive pranks. Typical headlines included: Youths disrupt Christmas Eve with disorderly conduct police disperse mob. Property damage in the name of Yuletide merriment. Is it time to end this nonsense? Mayor warns against street carousing during holiday week. Where once mischief was bounded by tradition, now it was unbound by anonymity, thanks to the growth of cities. The boy who tipped a cart or stole a cabbage was less likely to be known to his target. The joke became a faceless nuisance, sometimes escalating into vandalism, intimidation, or even violence. This shift from ritual inversion to lawbreaking made it easier for authorities to suppress the tradition. Over time, curfews were enforced, ordinances passed, and youth behavior more heavily policed. Public order clean, well-lit, and family-friendly became the new Christmas standard. The rise of Halloween and the transfer of mischief. But mischief doesn't die, it migrates. As Christmas lost its edge, another holiday, Halloween, began to absorb its festive inversion and youthful mischief. This shift was gradual but noticeable. In rural New England and parts of the Midwest, Cabbage Night and Mischief Night became associated not with Christmas Eve or New Year's, but with October 30th. The pranks and vandalism that had once been part of Christmas began to reappear in autumn. Soaked windows, stolen porch furniture, and farm implements left in strange places. The symbolism of reversal and liminality, once centered on the 12 days of Christmas, moved instead to All Hallows' Eve. By the early 20th century, Halloween had become the new misrule season, and with it, many old traditions were reborn, now divorced from their Yuletide roots. Even today, in places like upstate New York and northern New Jersey, October 30th is still known as Goosey Night, Gate Night, or Cabbage Night, depending on the region. What was once winter mischief is now autumn trouble. The sanitized holiday season. Today, Christmas in the United States is a carefully curated season focused on commercial consumption, family gatherings, religious observance for some, cultural nostalgia. Noise, mischief, and disruption are largely unwelcome. Rowdy carolers have been replaced by controlled choir performances. Street revelry is confined to parades, and pranks are met with legal consequences, not laughter. The spirit of misrule, once expressed through cabbage tossing and gate lifting, has been tamed. But in that taming, we may have lost something essential: the seasonal outlet for youthful rebellion, the sense that once a year, society could bend without breaking. Why the mischief mattered. Anthropologists and folklorists have long argued that ritual inversion serves a vital function in any community. Whether through the Lord of Misrule, Carnival, or Mischief Night, these disruptions allow marginal voices, often the young or poor, to be heard. Release social tensions in structured, non-lethal ways. Reinforce the resilience of the social order by showing it can withstand play. In early America, Christmas mischief, though chaotic, was a cultural pressure valve. Its disappearance may reflect progress, but also a narrowing of imagination, a reluctance to let disorder dance, even briefly. Modern echoes and tiny revivals. Though the full tradition of Christmas mischief has vanished, small echoes persist. In some towns, gag gifts and white elephant exchanges preserve the spirit of mockery. Elf on the Shelf, a manufactured but oddly successful invention, plays with the idea of hidden behavior, spying, and minor rule breaking, perhaps echoing deeper anxieties about seasonal order and control. In a few rural areas, masked caroling or Twelfth Night pranks have survived in fragmented form, reminders of a time when Christmas was messy, public, and slightly dangerous. We are unlikely to return to cabbage raids and turnip thefts, but the idea that holidays can contain both joy and rebellion, order and inversion, is worth preserving. A final reflection. Cabbage Night reminds us that Christmas was once a time not just of joy, but of playful subversion. It allowed the least powerful, the young, the poor, the excluded, a moment of noisy expression. Today, our holidays are safer, smoother, quieter. But perhaps in some small way, we might remember that even mischief has its place. And maybe, just maybe, the cabbage still waits outside the door, not as a threat, but as a joke, a jolt, a seasonal reminder that not all chaos is bad. Story 6. The Boy Bishop when children took over the church. The church is still. Candles flicker along cold stone walls. In the choir stalls, choristers whisper nervously. The bishop's throne, polished and draped in ceremonial cloth, waits. But the man who ascends to it is no seasoned cleric. He is a boy, perhaps 10, maybe 12. He wears a mitre nearly too large for his head, carries a crozier half his height, and is flanked by other children in solemn procession. Today, he is the bishop. For several centuries in medieval and early modern Europe, cathedrals and parish churches observed one of the strangest and most endearing customs of Christmastide, the election of a boy bishop. Between St. Nicholas Day, December 6th, and Holy Innocents' Day, December 28th, this child took on all the ceremonial roles of a real bishop except the Eucharist. He presided over services, gave sermons, issued blessings, and processed through towns with full ecclesiastical pomp. This wasn't a play. It was a recognized tradition, with deep roots in the complex relationship between ritual, inversion, and seasonal festivity in the Christian calendar. Who was this boy? Why did the church, known for hierarchy and formality, allow such a disruption? And what did this strange role reveal about the place of children, power, and play in the medieval imagination? Let's begin where the tradition begins, in the choir stalls of a medieval cathedral. The children of the choir. By the 12th century, many large churches and cathedrals had attached to them a school or college of choristers, boys trained not only in singing, but in basic Latin, reading, and Christian doctrine. These boys were often from modest backgrounds, housed and educated at the church's expense. Throughout the year, they sang the daily divine office, performed during feast days, and played a supporting role in the liturgical rhythm of the calendar. But once a year, on St. Nicholas Day, things changed. St. Nicholas, the 4th century bishop of Myra, had long been regarded as the patron saint of children. His feast day, December 6th, was a natural time to honor young people, and from this evolved the custom of choosing one choir boy to serve as boy bishop. He was elected by his peers, or sometimes appointed by the clergy, and was dressed in miniature episcopal garments, robes, ring, mitre, and crozier. For the duration of his tenure, sometimes a single day, other times the full 12 days of Christmas, he would perform many duties of a real bishop. From play to procession, the boy bishop's responsibilities varied by region and century. In England, Spain, France, and parts of Germany, the role could be highly ceremonial or light-hearted and parodic. Some of his duties included leading the choir in place of the adult bishop, delivering a mock or serious sermon, often written by a cleric but read by the boy, blessing the townspeople, particularly children and the poor, processing through town in episcopal regalia, sometimes receiving gifts or alms, presiding over feast day services, though not consecrating the Mass. In places like Salisbury, York, and Canterbury, the boy bishop's appearance was taken seriously. He was treated with the deference due to a real bishop. Townspeople bowed, clergy played along, and the boy was honored with gifts, meals, and occasional coins, forming one of the few times when a child could command public reverence. But the tradition was also tinged with satire. In some versions, the boy's procession included mocking of the clergy, jesters, or comic performances. In others, the boys sang playful hymns or recited moral poems, underscoring that their tenure, though brief, was also morally instructive. This inversion of roles was not intended to undermine the church. Quite the opposite. It was understood as a symbolic release, a way to affirm the seriousness of hierarchy by briefly upending it. Theological and cultural meaning. On its surface, the boy-bishop tradition seems out of place in an institution so steeped in hierarchy and adult authority. But in the medieval worldview, inversion was not blasphemy, it was ritual clarity. Much like the lord of misrule in secular society, see Story 1. The boy-bishop represented the turning of the world, a temporary inversion to mark the turn of the year. Medieval theology also saw children as spiritually pure, closer to God than corruptible adults. Christ himself had declared in the Gospels, "Unless you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So to place a child in the seat of the bishop was, paradoxically, to reaffirm the spiritual order. It reminded the clergy and laity alike that humility, innocence, and grace could sit upon a throne, even if only briefly. At the same time, it was understood that this rule was temporary, a contained performance. The boy's tenure would end, usually on Holy Innocents' Day, December 28th, with a ceremony of deposition, where the adult bishop reclaimed his role. This return to order reinforced the correctness of the hierarchy, even as it gave space for holy play. Where and when it flourished. The boy-bishop tradition was particularly strong in England, especially in cathedral towns like Salisbury, Lincoln, York, and Winchester. Spain, where similar customs developed around Epiphany and Los Santos Innocents. France, particularly in Paris and Rouen. Parts of Germany and the Low Countries. In England, the custom reached its height during the 13th to 15th centuries, with official records noting the expense of robes, processions, and entertainments. Even kings and nobles occasionally witnessed or endorsed the event. It was seen as both amusing and spiritually edifying. But by the 16th century, the tradition began to face pressure from both within and outside the church. Early suppression and changing attitudes. With the onset of the Protestant Reformation, attitudes toward ritual play and inversion began to shift. Reformers like those in Geneva or among the English Puritans saw the boy bishop not as a wholesome reminder of innocence, but as a mockery of sacred office. In England, the custom was abolished under Henry VIII in 1542, reinstated briefly under Mary I, and then eliminated again under Elizabeth I. Why the hostility? The Protestant emphasis on scripture over tradition made such performative customs suspect. The growing professionalization and dignity of clergy left little room for symbolic inversion. Concerns about blasphemy, mockery, and disorder replaced earlier comfort with playful ritual. Thus, the boy bishop disappeared from most churches by the early 17th century, though echoes of the practice lingered in folk memory. Unfinished reflections. What did it mean for a society to hand its sacred seat to a child, if only for a few days? Was it merely symbolic humility or a subtle critique of power itself? And what was lost when the church and society became too dignified to play? We'll follow the decline, memory, and revival of the boy-bishop tradition in modern times, and ask how such a peculiar practice can illuminate our understanding of authority, innocence, and the sacredness of play. When we last stood beside the young boy in bishop's robes, he was blessing his peers and presiding over services with the quiet authority of someone far too small for the grandeur around him. But the boy bishop was not simply a festive curiosity. His brief reign carried deep spiritual, cultural, and political meanings that became increasingly controversial in the centuries that followed. In this section, we explore how the boy bishop custom, once a respected part of the liturgical calendar, came under growing scrutiny. As Europe lurched from the late Middle Ages into the turbulence of the Reformation, the practice became a battleground for competing visions of order, piety, and meaning. What happened to this humble and humorous ritual? And why did its defenders and detractors view it with such intensity? Let's begin in 16th century England, where the boy bishop faced his first and most serious crisis: the Protestant Reformation and the death of holy play. The 1500s were a time of seismic upheaval in Europe's religious landscape. With Martin Luther's 95 Theses, 1517, the growing dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church found expression in a reform movement that swept across much of the continent. The reformers rejected not just papal authority and certain doctrines, but also many of the rituals and customs that had defined medieval religious life. In this climate, the boy bishop tradition became a target. While some communities saw it as harmless fun or even spiritual instruction, others now viewed it as a mockery of sacred office, a blurring of theological lines, allowing children to mimic bishops, a vestige of popish superstition and excessive festivity, an opening for disorder, frivolity, and irreverence during holy time. These critiques were especially potent in England, where the crown had its own reasons for suppressing festive traditions. Royal edicts and the boy bishop's ban. In 1542, King Henry VIII, having broken with Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England, issued a royal proclamation explicitly abolishing the boy bishop custom. The order reads in paraphrased form: "Because of the abuses and unseemly conduct that hath arisen from the feigned election of children to bishoprics, these shall be henceforth abolished, and none shall so pretend to such authority." The language is stark, labeling the practice as unseemly, feigned, and abusive. This decree wasn't only about theology. Henry VIII was engaged in a broader campaign to suppress folk traditions, reassert royal and clerical control, and remove rituals that might undermine hierarchical authority. Yet this was not the final word. When Henry's daughter, Mary I, 1553–1558, a devout Catholic, ascended to the throne, the ban was briefly reversed. She encouraged the return of traditional practices, including the boy bishop, as part of her efforts to restore Catholic worship. But her reign was short, and under Elizabeth I, the Protestant settlement was reimposed. The boy bishop once again disappeared from official record. The loss of festive inversion. As Protestantism solidified, the very concept of ritual inversion fell out of favor. For many Protestant reformers, especially Puritans, religion was to be orderly, sober, and morally upright. The idea of children acting out clerical roles was not quaint or instructive, it was irreverent, and perhaps even blasphemous. Simultaneously, larger cultural forces were reshaping the role of children in society. The emergence of childhood as a protected, disciplined phase of life meant less tolerance for exuberant play. Clerical roles became increasingly professionalized, closed off to symbolic disruption. The church's ritual calendar was simplified, stripped of many saints, days, and folk practices. The boy bishop, once a public spectacle of innocence and inversion, now seemed out of step with modernity. But the memory lingered. Echoes in literature and local lore. Though officially banned, the boy bishop lived on in stories, songs, and the nostalgia of communities who remembered the pageantry of their youth. In parts of rural England and Spain, localized versions of the custom persisted well into the 17th and 18th centuries, often stripped of their full religious meaning, but retaining their sense of festive misrule. In literature, the figure occasionally surfaced as a symbol of innocence in authority, or as an ironic commentary on power. 19th century writers such as Walter Scott referenced the custom in historical novels, using it to evoke the fading grandeur of medieval pageantry. In regional plays and Christmas dramas, boys dressed as bishops sometimes appeared, now more as quaint echoes than ecclesiastical figures. Folklorists of the 19th century began documenting remnants of the tradition, interviewing elderly parishioners who remembered boy bishops from childhood or family stories. These survivals suggest that, even in suppression, the custom retained cultural weight, theological defenses, and spiritual meaning. Curiously, some theologians, especially in pre-Reformation times, had gone to great lengths to defend the boy bishop on spiritual grounds. For them, the tradition wasn't mockery, but a lesson in humility. By elevating a child, the church reminded adults of Christ's teaching. The last shall be first, and the first last. Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them. Some medieval sermons preached by or about boy bishops invoked the innocence and moral clarity of children as a model for adult behavior. And in communities where the practice persisted longest, it was not viewed as profane but devotional, connecting young boys with the responsibility of service, however symbolically. These theological underpinnings were largely lost after the Reformation, but they have resurfaced in recent revivals. The seeds of revival. Starting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, interest in medieval liturgical customs began to return first among scholars, and then among Anglo-Catholics and liturgical enthusiasts. The Oxford movement in England, 1830s-40s, which sought to reintroduce elements of Catholic ritual to the Church of England, helped inspire ceremonial revivals. These included reinstating elaborate vestments, celebrating lesser-known saints' days, reenacting old processions, pageants, and yes, boy bishop elections. By the mid-20th century, several English cathedrals including Hereford, Salisbury, and Westminster Abbey began reviving the boy bishop in a liturgical and educational context. These modern iterations are usually scheduled around St. Nicholas Day or Advent, involve a carefully chosen chorister leading prayers, readings, or community events. Seen not as satire but as a celebration of youth, voice, and dignity. The return of the sacred child. What's striking about these revivals is how earnest they are. Gone is the ambiguity of mockery. Instead, the boy bishop is now celebrated as a symbol of inclusion, of reminding the church that children are not merely passive recipients of faith, but voices within it. Some even preach sermons on topics like justice, compassion, or stewardship of the earth. Others bless congregants or lead charitable initiatives, echoes of their medieval predecessors, giving alms in town processions. While these revivals are not widespread, they offer a glimpse into how the past can be reinterpreted not as relic or curiosity, but as a living reminder that power and wisdom can reside in the small and the silent. Unfinished reflections. What does it say about us that we once allowed a child to wear a bishop's robes? Were we more open to symbolic inversion, to humility, to play? Or have we simply found new ways to channel those values more modern, more structured, less strange? We will conclude the story of the boy bishop by examining how this tradition resonates today, how it has been transformed in churches and classrooms, and what deeper truths it might reveal about our enduring fascination with authority, childhood, and sacred performance. By now, you've seen the rise and fall of a tradition that allowed a boy to don the robes of a bishop, lead processions, and issue blessings to an adult world that, for a few days each December, bowed before childhood. In this final section, we explore how the boy bishop tradition has returned quietly, cautiously, and thoughtfully in modern times. Far from the high medieval cathedrals and solemn Latin chants, today's boy bishops may stand in candlelit churches, or even in classrooms, delivering messages of kindness and responsibility. But the deeper question remains: what does it mean to symbolically place power in the hands of the young? And what can this ritual, once banned and nearly forgotten, still teach us? We begin with a quiet revival in a place where tradition runs deep: Hereford Cathedral, England. Hereford's living legacy. Nestled in the English countryside, Hereford Cathedral has preserved its medieval foundations with great care. In the early 1990s, the cathedral's clergy and choristers revived the boy bishop tradition, not as novelty or historical reenactment, but as part of a living liturgy. Every year around St. Nicholas Day, December 6th, a boy bishop is chosen from among the choristers. He wears a hand-sewn mitre, holds a wooden crozier, and processes with the choir into the cathedral's nave, where he delivers a short address usually on a moral or spiritual theme, such as treating others with kindness, the importance of listening, protecting the vulnerable, the value of peace and stillness. He stands not behind the altar, but before the people, flanked by adults, yet briefly elevated by tradition. The entire community listens, and though the sermon may be short, just a few hundred words, it is treated with full seriousness. What's notable about Hereford's approach is its lack of irony. The boy bishop is not there to play or parody. He is, for that moment, a moral voice, a reminder of Christ's teaching that the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Reclaiming the symbol, from subversion to empowerment. Across Europe and beyond, similar revivals have sprung up in recent decades. In France, parishes in Rouen and Bayeux have held enfants avec ceremonies, where children lead community prayers. In Germany, the tradition is echoed in Nicolaspiel pageants, though more theatrical than liturgical. In Spain, a related tradition of Los Obispillos in Burgos sees a boy dressed as bishop leading a parade through town, still drawing thousands. These modern iterations vary widely. Some are devotional, others festive, and a few are clearly performative pageantry. But what unites them is the desire to place children at the center, not as decorations, but as agents of meaning. In classrooms, too, the idea has taken root. Certain religious schools, particularly in Britain, have adapted the boy bishop as an educational tool. A student elected as bishop may lead morning prayers for the week. Others may assist with charitable drives, distribute gifts, or give presentations on kindness. The role is often tied to lessons on medieval history, the life of St. Nicholas, or the symbolism of Advent. The ancient inversion, once bordering on subversion, has become a way to foster responsibility, give voice to youth, and connect children with the rhythms of tradition. Ritual inversion and the psychology of play. Why do these modern revivals matter? At first glance, it might seem quaint. A child dressed up, reading from a script mimicking roles once held by powerful men. But dig deeper, and you find that the symbolic inversion still carries weight. Anthropologists like Victor Turner and Mary Douglas have long explored the importance of liminal spaces, those transitional moments in rituals where ordinary roles are reversed, suspended, or blurred. The boy bishop, in this sense, offers a ritualized space for reflection. For the child, it's an affirmation that their voice matters, that they are capable of spiritual and moral insight. For the community, it's a reminder of humility, of the fragility of authority, and the enduring wisdom that sometimes comes from unexpected places. In psychological terms, it is a structured play event with boundaries and meaning. Play, after all, is not the opposite of seriousness. In many cultures, it is how truth is processed, tested, and conveyed. A boy in a bishop's mitre may not hold real power, but for a brief time, he holds symbolic authority. And in communities that honor that moment, something sacred happens. The tension between order and innocence. Still, not everyone has welcomed these revivals. In some conservative or evangelical circles, the boy bishop is dismissed as a relic of Catholic superstition. Others see it as trivializing a solemn office or fear that symbolic elevation of children could lead to confusion. But these criticisms often miss the point. The boy bishop is not about confusion, it is about contradiction, and the creative, spiritual tension that comes from holding two truths at once. That authority must be respected and questioned. That wisdom often comes from age, and sometimes from innocence. That roles matter and can be inverted to reveal deeper truths. In an age when institutions are questioned, hierarchies are debated, and childhood is often either overprotected or overexposed, the boy bishop stands as a quiet, strange alternative, a ritual that says play is not just allowed but sacred. Echoes in secular culture. Interestingly, the spirit of the boy bishop lives on even outside the church. In schools, student councils, mock elections, and symbolic leadership days replicate some aspects of the custom. These events empower children to lead assemblies, propose ideas, advocate for peers, represent their community. Though they lack the robes and incense, they often carry the same core message. Your voice matters even if you're small. Even in secular pageantry such as holiday parades, school nativity plays, and community festivals, there are moments where children take on adult roles, echoing the symbolic inversions of older rites. Whether we realize it or not, we still long to place children in roles of meaning, not to parody adulthood, but to honor their potential. Lessons from a lost crozier. What do we learn, then, from the strange journey of the boy bishop? Tradition is not static. It evolves, vanishes, returns changed but still resonant. Children are not merely symbols of innocence. They can be bearers of wisdom, agents of empathy, and carriers of ritual meaning. Authority can be playfully inverted without being destroyed. In fact, inversion may reinforce the value of roles by reminding us that they are human constructs, powerful, but not divine. Ritual play is not foolishness. It is a human need to test boundaries, to explore meaning, and to hold a mirror to ourselves. And perhaps most importantly, the smallest voice, lifted up in ceremony, can still echo through stone cloisters and centuries. A final reflection. Somewhere in a quiet cathedral, a boy stands nervously in oversized robes. He clears his throat, looks out at a congregation of adults, and begins to speak not as himself, but as something older, larger, stranger. And in that moment, the world tilts slightly. It is still Advent. The days are short. The year draws near its close, but for a few minutes the oldest structures give way to the youngest among us. Not as jest, not as mockery, but as a kind of ritual remembering of the Christ child, of humility, of the enduring wisdom of play. And as he speaks, we listen not just to his words, but to what he represents. The boy bishop has returned, and with him the quiet, forgotten truth that even the powerless can wear the mitre, if only for a day.